Flint Hills, Kansas, August 1874. The sun was a hammer on an anvil of dry grass. The heat baked the earth into a cracked plate, and the horizon shimmered, making the few cottonwoods along the distant creek seem to tremble. Most men were racing the calendar, felling those trees, hewing them into rough logs for the cabins they had to raise before the first snow. A square house, a proper roof. This was the grammar of survival on the prairie, a lesson written in the failed homesteads of those who learned too slowly. But Séamus Ó Floinn was not building a cabin. He was hauling limestone. With a timber lever and a stone boat pulled by a single tired ox, he wrestled flat gray slabs from the creek bed, dragging them to his claim on a low, treeless rise. There he was not squaring ends or notching logs. He was laying a circle of stones, a perfect ring 16 feet across. Dobbs Wakerly, the county surveyor, paused his work, peering from under the brim of his hat. He leaned against the tripod of his theodolite, a man who understood the world in straight lines and right angles. He watched the Irishman for a long 10 minutes, a small, stubborn figure moving against the enormous sky. Wakerly saw no frame, no joists, no logic. He saw a man stacking rocks like a child. "Building a well, Ó Floinn?" Wakerly called out, his voice thick with condescension. Séamus paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "A house," he said, his voice quiet, carrying the soft edges of his native Irish. Wakerly laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. He gestured to two other settlers, Silas Croft and Jedediah Miller, who had stopped their wagon to watch the strange labor. "He's building a root cellar to live in," Wakerly announced, loud enough for all to hear. "The man's gone mad from the sun." Croft and Miller chuckled. It was foolish. Everyone knew a house was made of wood and had 4 corners. This circular folly was the work of a man who didn't understand the prairie, a man who would surely fail. What did this Irish clochán mason understand about thermal mass that a county surveyor and every seasoned frontiersman had missed? If you stay with us, I promise you will learn the forgotten physics of the stone dome, a principle of survival so powerful it allowed a family to thrive where others shivered. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of our ancestors. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss a single story of ingenuity. And as you watch, think about this. What's the most unconventional but effective solution to a problem you've ever witnessed? Tell us about it in the comments below. Séamus Ó Floinn was not a carpenter. He had never swung a felling axe in his life before coming to America. He was not a farmer, though he was learning the hard calculus of seed and soil. Back on the Dingle Peninsula, on the windswept coast of County Kerry, he was a stone man. His hands knew the specific heft of slate, the gritty texture of granite, the cold, damp feel of stones pulled from the sea. His trade was ancient, a skill passed down through generations that predated mortar and kings. He was a builder of clocháns, the dry-stacked, corbelled stone beehive huts that had dotted the Irish hills for more than 1,000 years. His tools were not saws and planes, but heavy iron levers, splitting hammers, and an intuitive understanding of gravity. He knew how to make stone flow, how to lock massive slabs together with nothing but their own weight and careful placement. He had brought his wife, Ulf, and their 2 children, 7-year-old Fionn and 5-year-old Bridget, to Kansas for the promise of land. But the land gave its promises only to those who could survive its terms. Their first winter had been the negotiation. They had spent it in a hastily built lean-to, a crude box of green cottonwood logs chinked with mud and grass. It was a structure that obeyed the frontier's visual rules, but failed its physical test. That winter, the cold was a living entity. It seeped through the walls, which were never anything more than frozen wood. The log cabin bled heat from every corner. The family would huddle by the fire, their fronts roasting while their backs felt the icy touch of the drafts that snaked across the floor. In the mornings, Séamus would build up the fire from embers, but the flames seemed to be swallowed by the cold. The roaring fire barely raised the temperature away from the hearth, and the walls themselves remained at or near freezing. Alf would find a rime of frost tracing the gaps in the chinking, a delicate and deadly lacework. She spent hours restuffing the cracks with rags and moss, a battle she could never win. The children slept in all their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Séamus burned through his entire woodpile by January and was forced to trade precious seed grain for more. He swore he would not face another winter defenseless. He knew wood was a fast fuel, but it was a poor container for heat. Stone, he knew, was different. Stone held its warmth like a memory. The failure of the conventional log cabin in the face of a prairie winter was not a failure of materials, but of physics. The settlers of the Flint Hills were competent builders, their craftsmanship honed by necessity. They could raise a sturdy wall and a tight roof, but they were fighting the wrong enemy. They thought the enemy was the wind, so they focused on sealing cracks. The true enemy was the relentless, conductive heat loss through the thin building envelope and the inefficient geometry of their homes. A standard log wall, milled or hand-hewn, was perhaps 8 to 10 inches thick. Wood has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of about 1.2 per inch. An 8-inch wall, then, had an R value of less than 10. By comparison, a modern insulated wall is often R19 or higher. This meant the heat generated by their fires passed through the log walls with alarming speed, radiating out into the minus 20-degree air. They were essentially trying to heat the entire state of Kansas. The problem was compounded by the shape of the house itself, the square. Every corner was a thermal weak point. In these 4 90-degree angles, the cold from 2 exterior walls met, creating a surface area that bled heat faster than any other part of the structure. Warm air from the fireplace would rise, travel across the ceiling, hit the cold outer walls, and sink. In the corners, this sinking, cooling air would pool, creating a persistent, miserable draft even in a perfectly sealed room. It was a slow, invisible vortex of cold. You could see the evidence in every cabin. At the Croft homestead, Martha Croft kept her water bucket just 10 feet from a constantly roaring fireplace, yet it often had a skin of ice on it by morning. Dobbs Wakerly, for all his surveying precision, lived in a cabin where the northern wall was perpetually damp with condensation that froze into a fine, sparkling dust. Families would hang blankets to partition their single rooms, trying to create a smaller, warmer space around the hearth, effectively abandoning half their home to the killing cold. They burned through cords of wood at an astonishing rate, the currency of their survival, only to feel the chill return the moment the fire was banked for the night. The problem wasn't their work ethic. The problem was thermodynamics. Séamus Ó Floinn began his work in earnest in late August. The circular foundation was finished, a dense ring of the heaviest stones he could manage. Now he began to build upward. He worked methodically, with an economy of motion that belied the immense weight of the stones he was moving. He selected each slab of limestone with a mason's eye, judging its flatness, its weight, its integrity. He was building 2 walls at once, an inner and an outer ring, separated by a gap of about 8 inches. The total thickness of the wall was a full 24 inches. As the parallel walls rose, he filled the gap between them with smaller stones and rubble, packing it tight. This wasn't just insulation. It was mass. Tons and tons of it. There was no mortar, no mud, no chinking. The weight of the structure was its own binding agent. The fit was so precise that a knife blade could not be slipped between the stones of the inner and outer faces. Once the wall reached a height of about 4 feet, the true artistry began. This was the corbelling, the technique he had learned on the Irish coast. With each new course, he set the stones of the inner ring slightly inward, cantilevering them over the course below by just an inch or two. The outer ring remained vertical. The process was painstakingly slow. Each stone had to be perfectly balanced and counterweighted by the stones beside it and the rubble fill behind it. A mistake could compromise the entire structure. Dobbs Wakerly made it a point to ride by Séamus's claim at least twice a week. He saw the strange, curving wall rising, and his skepticism hardened into something approaching official indignation. "Still building your savage hut, Ó Floinn?" he called one afternoon, reining in his horse. "I hope you've told your wife she'll be living in a pile of rocks." Séamus simply placed another stone, nudging it into place with his lever. "The stones know their place, Mr. Wakerly." "Stones fall," Wakerly retorted, pointing with his riding crop. "That thing you're building, it has no support. No king post, no beams, no rafters. What do you think will happen when 4 feet of snow lands on that roof? It will collapse on your family. A man has a duty to provide a proper shelter." He paused, his tone shifting from mockery to a threat. "The Homestead Act requires a habitable improvement to prove a claim. This is not an improvement. It's a liability. I am the county surveyor, Mr. Ó Floinn. It is my duty to report on the claims. I will have to note that your structure is unsound and unfit for habitation." Séamus looked up from his work, his blue eyes calm. "It will be sound," he said. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact. Then he turned back to his wall. Wakerly scoffed and rode off, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn fool. Other neighbors would watch from a distance, shaking their heads. They saw the small, lintel-topped doorway, the lack of windows, the bizarre, inward curving walls. It looked primitive, ancient, something from a forgotten world. They didn't see the genius of the design. They didn't see the double-skinned wall, the carefully packed rubble, or the subtle, masterful geometry of the corbelled dome that was slowly taking shape, ring by patient ring, until it enclosed the space, leaving only a small opening at the apex for smoke to escape. To understand why Séamus Ó Floinn's stone hut worked, you have to understand a fundamental concept of thermal physics, thermal mass. It is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. While the frontiersmen were focused on insulation, resisting the flow of heat, Séamus was focused on storage. He wasn't building a barrier, he was building a battery for heat. Let's consider the numbers. The finished clochán had a diameter of 16 feet and a height of about 10 feet. The walls were 2 feet thick. Limestone has a density of approximately 170 pounds per cubic foot. A conservative calculation of the dome's volume reveals that Séamus had assembled over 60 tons of stone. 60 tons. That is the weight of 35 horses. When he lit a small fire inside, he wasn't just heating the air in the room. He was pouring heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, into that colossal mass of limestone. Wood heats up quickly and cools down quickly. It has low thermal mass. Stone, on the other hand, has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly, steadily, over many hours. The small fire Séamus maintained during the day was constantly charging the stone walls. By evening, those 60 tons of limestone had absorbed hundreds of thousands of BTUs. Then as night fell and the fire was banked to smoldering embers, the physics reversed. Outside, the temperature would plummet to 10, 20, even 30 degrees below zero. In a log cabin, the stored heat in the wooden walls would dissipate in an hour or two, and the interior temperature would begin to crash. But in the clochán, the massive, heat-saturated stone walls began to slowly radiate their stored energy back into the interior space. It was a gentle, even heat coming from every direction at once. The structure had become its own furnace, a low, slow fire made of stone that would burn all night long. The second crucial element was the geometry of the dome. A square room has 400 cubic feet of dead air in its corners that doesn't circulate well. These corners become cold sinks, driving the miserable convection currents that made log cabins so drafty. A dome has no corners. The curved walls promote natural, gentle air circulation. The warm air rises from the fire, moves along the curved ceiling, and as it cools slightly, it sinks down the opposite wall, flowing across the floor back toward the heat source. There are no cold pools, no dead zones. Every cubic foot of air in the space is part of a slow, continuous, warm loop. The shape itself was an engine of comfort, an elegant solution that eliminated the very problem the square box created. The cold snap arrived in the second week of January. It came without drama, a silent, crystalline hardening of the world. The temperature dropped past zero and kept falling. For 16 consecutive days, the thermometer never rose above minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless, light wind blew from the north, not a gale, but a steady, scouring pressure that seemed to draw the very warmth from the earth. There were no trees on Séamus's claim to act as a windbreak. His dome stood alone on the rise, exposed to the full, brutal force of the prairie winter. For the other settlers, it was a catastrophe. The shallow cold had given way to a deep, penetrating freeze. At the Croft homestead, their well pump froze solid. Silas spent 2 days trying to thaw it with hot coals, only to have the cast iron crack. They resorted to melting snow for water, a task that consumed yet more of their dwindling firewood. They started burning fence posts, then a broken wagon wheel, then a chair. Their cabin was a fortress under siege, and they were losing. The Wakerly family, in their well-built 2-room cabin, had abandoned the larger room entirely. They hung every blanket they owned over the connecting doorway and lived huddled in the smaller space, feeding their stove constantly. Even so, the milk froze in the pail on the table, and Wakerly's wife wept when she found her preserved vegetables had frozen and burst their glass jars in the pantry. Across the county, livestock froze, standing in the fields. The sound of a splitting axe on frozen wood echoed across the stark landscape, a desperate, rhythmic prayer for warmth. Inside the stone clochán, another reality existed. The howl of the wind was a distant, muffled whisper. The 24-inch stone walls muted the storm, creating a profound and peaceful quiet. Séamus kept a small, steady fire going in the center of the floor, using a careful mix of scavenged wood and dried buffalo chips. The smoke rose in a lazy column to the smoke hole at the apex of the dome. The air was warm and still. Here, the small details of life, impossible in the neighboring cabins, continued uninterrupted. Aoife was kneading dough for bread on their small wooden table. The butter in the ceramic crock next to her was soft and spreadable. On the floor, on a sheepskin rug, Fionn and Bridget were not bundled in coats, but in simple wool sweaters, drawing pictures on a piece of slate. The only sound was the quiet hiss of the fire and the soft thump of Aoife working the dough. They were not just surviving the cold snap, they were living comfortably through it, shielded from the storm by a principle the world outside their wall had forgotten. Late one night, on the 10th day of the freeze, Séamus banked the fire with ash for the night. The interior was lit only by a single tallow candle. Eowulf and the children were asleep under their blankets. He walked to the wall, the one facing the brutal north wind. Outside, the temperature was minus 18 degrees. He placed his open palm flat against the cool, smooth stone of the interior wall. It was not cold. It was warm. A deep, gentle warmth radiated from it, the stored energy of the day's small fire. It felt like living flesh. At midnight, with the world frozen solid, His house was breathing heat. It was on the 12th day of the cold snap that Dobbs Wakerly made his move. He saw the extreme weather not as a shared trial, but as an opportunity for proof. He rode the 5 miles to the nearest town, his face raw and his beard stiff with ice, and returned with Mr. Abernathy, a land agent from the district office in Topeka. Abernathy was a man who lived by the book, and Wakerly had been filling his ears for months about the Irishman's unfit dwelling. The brutal cold, Wakerly argued, was the perfect time for an official inspection. It would make the patent denial an open and shut case. They arrived at the dome on horseback, 2 figures so bundled in wool and hide they seemed inhuman. Ice clung to their horses' muzzles. "You'll see, sir," Wakerly shouted over the wind, his voice triumphant. "I filed the report weeks ago. It's not a dwelling, it's a cave, unfit for human habitation, just as I stated. They're probably freezing to death in there." Abernathy, a methodical man in his 50s, just nodded, his face grim. He dismounted stiffly and strode to the small wooden door. He expected to be hit by a wave of frigid, damp air, the kind you find in a cellar. He pulled the door open, bracing himself. Instead, a soft, silent cloud of still, warm air washed over him. He stopped dead. The sensation was so profoundly contrary to his expectation that it momentarily confused him. There was no draft. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and baking bread. He stood in the doorway, stunned. As the warmth seeped into his frozen clothes, he slowly began to unwrap the thick wool scarf from his face. Wakerly pushed in behind him, his own face a mask of disbelief. He saw the small, calm fire. He saw the 2 children playing on the floor, their coats hung on pegs by the door. He saw Séamus Ó Floinn rise from a stool, not with the gaunt, desperate look of his own wife, but with a calm politeness. Abernathy stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the packed earth floor. His eyes scanned the impossible scene. He was a man of process. He walked deliberately to the far wall, the one furthest from the fire, the one taking the full brunt of the northern wind. Without a word, he pulled off his thick leather glove. He placed his bare palm flat against the curved stone wall. He held it there for a full 10 seconds. His expression did not change, but Wakerly, watching him, saw the rigid certainty in the surveyor's posture begin to crumble. The proof was not an argument. It was a physical sensation, an undeniable transfer of energy from stone to skin. Finally, Abernathy turned to Wakerly, though his eyes were still on the wall. "What did you say the temperature was outside, Mr. Wakerly?" "-15, sir," Wakerly stammered. "Maybe colder with this wind." Abernathy's gaze fell upon a small, cheap thermometer hanging from a nail on a wooden shelf. "It is 66 degrees in here," he said softly. He then turned his full attention to Séamus. "Mr. Ó Floinn, how much fuel have you burned today?" Séamus gestured to a small pile of wood and buffalo chips near the fire. It was perhaps an eighth of what Wakerly knew he had burned in his own stove since morning. Wakerly was speechless. He walked to the wall himself, as if needing his own senses to confirm the impossible. He placed his hand on the stone. The warmth was real. It was not the scorching heat of a fireplace, but a deep, pervasive, life-giving warmth. He looked from the wall to the small fire, then back to the wall. The physics of it, so alien to his understanding, slowly dawned on him. Abernathy walked back to the table and pulled the patent documents from his satchel. He uncapped his ink pen, dipped it, and signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. He stamped it with his official seal. He looked at Séamus, then at the dome that surrounded them, a silent testament to a forgotten wisdom. "You didn't build a house, Mr. Ó Floinn," the inspector said, his voice filled with a new respect. "You built a low, slow fire made of stone. He handed the approved patent to Séamus. Mr. Abernathy, the land agent from Topeka, ended up staying for 40 minutes, sipping the hot tea Awaf offered him, and asking Séamus detailed questions about the corbelling, the wall thickness, and the foundation. On the official document, in the margin next to his signature, he wrote a clear, 7-word endorsement. Superior dwelling exceeds all habitation requirements. Mr. Abernathy was more than just a bureaucrat. He was a man who recognized a profound solution to a deadly problem. When he returned to Topeka, he did not simply file the approved patent. He wrote a detailed 2-page report on what he had witnessed. He titled it, Observations on the corbelled stone dwelling and its application to prairie settlement. He included a rough sketch of the dome's cross-section, detailing the double wall construction and the inward curving design. He praised its incredible fuel efficiency, its resistance to wind, and its construction from materials readily available on any claim. This report was copied and distributed as an official land office circular to agents in 3 counties. It was meant as a practical guide for new settlers, a piece of vetted, life-saving information. The Ó Floinn Dome, as some began to call it, was no longer the subject of ridicule. It was now an officially recognized innovation. That spring, after the thaw, 3 families, including the Millers, who had once laughed at Séamus, came to his homestead. They did not come to mock. They came with notebooks and questions, hat in hand. Séamus, a man who never gloated, spent days walking them through the process, showing them how to lay the foundation ring true, how to choose the right stones, how to begin the delicate process of corbelling. The knowledge spread not through books, but through demonstration, from one neighbor to another. The sight of stone circles beginning to rise on the prairie was the quiet validation of a wisdom that had been right all along. The principles that kept Séamus Ó Floinn's family warm in 1874 are more relevant today than ever. His stone dome was a perfect example of what modern building science calls a thermal flywheel. High-mass structures, like those built from stone, concrete, or adobe, act as climate moderators. They resist rapid temperature swings, staying cool in the summer and warm in the winter by absorbing and releasing energy over long periods. This ancient technique prefigured the core concepts of passive building design by more than a century, achieving remarkable energy efficiency with zero advanced technology. The lesson of the clochán is one that architects and engineers are rediscovering. In an age of complex climate control systems and expensive insulation, the simple, profound wisdom of using a building's own mass to create a stable, comfortable interior environment remains one of the most elegant and sustainable solutions available. Séamus's dome was not primitive. It was profoundly advanced. A square house is an argument with the prairie. It presents 4 flat walls to the wind, daring it to strike. It has sharp corners that hoard the cold, creating zones of useless, shivering space. It is an architecture of opposition, constantly consuming fuel in a desperate, inefficient battle to hold the winter at bay. Its flat roof is a surface designed to shed snow, but also to bleed heat directly into the empty sky. It is a structure defined by what it wastes. The dome that Séamus Ó Floinn built was a conversation with the landscape. It wasted nothing. Its curved form presented no hard edge to the wind, allowing the current of air to flow around it, minimizing pressure and infiltration. It had no corners to hoard the cold, ensuring every inch of its interior was a part of the living space. Its massive circular wall did not try to block the cold, but rather to absorb the warmth, holding it patiently and giving it back when it was needed most. Even the smoke hole was a model of efficiency, drawing the exhaust out with minimal heat loss. It was a perfect, closed loop of energy and form, a structure that found its strength not in opposition but in accommodation. It proved that true resilience is not about how big a fire you can build, but about how well you can hold its warmth. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of practical genius from the frontier. We believe the past holds powerful lessons for the present. In that spirit, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other ancient building techniques do you think could solve modern problems? Your insights help keep this conversation alive. Thank you for joining us. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The story presented is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical building practices and frontier life. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. The technical principles of thermal mass and corbelled stone construction are based on real historical and scientific concepts. However, any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified architects, engineers, and building professionals, and in full compliance with current local building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.